first education. Although, as Gleaves mentioned, he received but 12 months of formal education in his life, Lincoln was an avid reader from an early age. According to his family members, he was a constant, stubborn reader who would read all the books he could lay his hands on. Quote, he read diligently, studied in the daytime, went to bed early, got up early, and read. He read the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Shakespeare, Bunyan, Burns, Defoe, Byron, Poe, and books about spelling, grammar, mathematics, and history. According to his stepmother, when he came across a passage that struck him, he would write it down on boards if he had no paper, and keep it until he did get paper. Then he would rewrite it, look at it, repeat it, internalize it. He ciphered on boards when he had no paper and no slate, and when the board would get too black, he would shave it off with a drawing knife and go on again. It's very laborious studies, not what we have today. He continued with great discipline into his adult life. After he moved to New Salem, Illinois, he was known as a bookworm, and he read for pleasure and for self-improvement. After studying hard for 2 or 3 hours in the evening, writes Burlingame, Lincoln would relax with a volume of his own poems. The result was that Lincoln became a man of extraordinary literary skill. No less than Ralph Waldo Emerson would later say, the weight and penetration of the many passages of Lincoln's letters, messages, and speeches are destined for wide fame. What pregnant definitions, what unerring common sense, what foresight, and on great occasions, what lofty and more than national, what human tone. Transcendent praise from the nation's great transcendentalist. Lincoln's studies, according to Burlingame, helped, quote, liberate him from his backwoods environment. Self-education is often then where Lincoln found his happiness. While Emerson wrote about Lincoln's lofty words at great moments, they weren't always so lofty. Historian Paul Bowler has written about the September 21st, 1862 meeting at which Lincoln surprised his cabinet with his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. None of them saw it coming. And this was a great moment indeed. The president was reading a book and hardly noticed me when I came in, Secretary of War Stanton later recalled. Finally, he turned to us and said, "Gentlemen, did you ever read anything by Artemus Ward? Let me read a chapter. It is very funny." Lincoln then read aloud something by humorist Ward entitled "The High-Handed Outrage at Utica." Furious at what he regarded as buffoonery on Lincoln's part, Stanton almost got up and left, but Lincoln read until the end of the piece, and then he laughed heartily. Everyone else was silent. "Gentlemen," said Lincoln disappointedly, "why don't you laugh? With the fearful strain that is upon me night and day, if I do not laugh, I should die. And you need this medicine as much as I do," he said. Then he reached into his tall hat on the table, took out a piece of paper, and said, "I have a very important piece of business to discuss with you today." Lincoln proceeded to read the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Preceded it with, apparently, this buffoonery, as Stan described it. Laughter, like learning, was a medicine that helped Lincoln overcome his depression. From childhood until the end of his life, Lincoln collected jokes and anecdotes that could raise spirits, entertain on the Illinois circuit, and illustrate the points he wanted to make. His well of stories never ran dry, writes Joshua Schenck, because he was always refilling it. He gathered materials from other people and from books. Schenck calls humor, I'll set this aside, excuse me. Schenck calls humor protection from Lincoln's mental storms. Lincoln himself called jokes the vents of my mood and gloom, and humor an emollient that saves me much friction and distress. I laugh, the president told friends in the depths of the Civil War, because I must not cry. He found humor in everything. Once staring out a window in his office in Springfield, Lincoln observed a woman with what was described as a many-plumed hat walking across a muddy street out the window. She slipped and fell. "She reminds me of a duck," Lincoln told the gentleman standing next to him. "Why is that?" "Feathers on her head and down on her behind," replied Lincoln. Another time in court, a lawyer embarrassedly argued a case with a large split in the rear of his pants. He's up there facing the judge, and everybody's getting a sense of his underwear and all that. It was a good time for him. One of Lincoln's amused colleagues passed around a subscription paper for other lawyers to pledge donations to buy their colleague a new pair of pants. Beside his name on the sheet, Lincoln wrote, "I can contribute nothing to the end in view." He loved the play on words. Hidden behind Lincoln's jokes and stories, though, was enormous ambition. In his deepest depression in 1841, Lincoln declared to his friend Joshua Speed that he would be more than willing to die. "But I have an irrepressible desire to live till I can be assured that the world is a little better for my having lived in it." He wanted to connect himself with the great events transpiring in his generation, according to Speed, and to so impress himself upon them as to link his name with something that would redound to the interests of his fellow man. At first, Lincoln's ambition lacked focus. In the course of 10 years, writes biographer Donald, Lincoln tried nearly every kind of work on the frontier: carpenter, riverboat man, store clerk, soldier, merchant, postmaster, blacksmith, surveyor, lawyer, politician. His greatest ambitions were as a lawyer and politician, and he applied himself to perfecting both as intensely as he applied himself to his boyhood studies. We can all relate to Lincoln's best efforts to evade the troubling aspects of his life by channeling his energy into his passion, education, his hobby, storytelling, and his career. But in Lincoln's case, his love of learning, his search for humor, and his overweening ambition probably saved him from his otherwise insurmountable depression. And as the remainder of our discussion here will make plain, we are all better off for it. In the midst of the Civil War, an old woman visited Lincoln at the Executive Mansion to beg that her husband be released from the Army so that he could come help support the family. When Lincoln granted her request, she left with tears of joy in her eyes. "It is more than many can often say," Lincoln wrote in a letter to Joshua Speed, "that in doing right, one can make two people happy in one day. Speed, die when I may, I want it said of me by those who know me best, that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower when I thought a flower would grow." Plucked a thistle and planted a flower. When Lincoln entered the world of politics, he did so with numerous ideas about how government could intervene to ease the burden on individual Americans and to reduce obstacles in their pursuit of happiness, to plant thistles wherever possible. His political philosophy owed much to his forebears. 40 years before Lincoln received his political education, two visions for promoting public happiness in the United States were born in competition. They can be traced to debates in George Washington's cabinet between Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. They crystallized in the first party system, and they survived into the new century. Two visions, Jefferson's America and Hamilton's America, persisted into Lincoln's day in debates over presidential power, territorial expansion, internal improvements, banks, tariffs, and states' rights. As we shall see, Lincoln was born into one, but in many ways, in many respects, he adopted the other. His vision would ultimately be an amalgamation of the two. Let's take a closer look. Thomas Jefferson, on the one hand, wanted to author a new Declaration of Independence for individual Americans. He wanted to free people from the whims of government, from the contrivances of profiteers, from creditors. This is an important point for a man who inherited and accumulated significant debt in his lifetime, almost insurmountable debt, and from all forms of dependence, foreign and domestic. Dependence, wrote Jefferson, begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and perpetuates fit tools in the designs of ambition. Jefferson's vision required vacant lands. Vacant lands to liberate the coming generations of Americans from corrupt cities as he saw them. It is not surprising, then, that Jefferson contemplated as governor of Virginia the forcible acquisition of Detroit and Lake Erie from the British in order to add that extensive and fertile country, in his words, to the empire of liberty. Or that as president he took an interest in territory west of the Mississippi River, commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore lands all the way to the Pacific, and purchased the Louisiana Territory from France after threatening to fight a war for it.